On June the 11th, Chancellor Rachel Reeves announced the result of the government spending review, which confirmed the budgets that each government department will have until 2028. The Department for Education, or DfE's budget, will rise from £101 billion to £109 billion over this period, an increase of 0.8% after adjusting for inflation. So, is the spending review outcome a good or bad result for the DfE? How did schools, colleges and universities fare in relation to each other within the DfE's spending plans? And what question marks remain about how the DfE will prioritise its spending going forward? My guests are Katie Carr, an Associate Director at the consultancy Public First, and Dani Payne, Senior Researcher at the Social Market Foundation think tank. I'm Tom Richmond, and to find out what the spending review means for the education sector, let's go inside your ed.
Welcome to Inside Your Ed, the podcast that looks inside the latest stories from across the education system in England, including primary and secondary schools, colleges, universities, and apprenticeships. You can listen to all our past episodes, subscribe to future episodes, and get in touch by visiting insideyoured.com.
Let's begin our discussion by jumping back to just before the spending review, because a lot of announcements were being made by government in the run-up to this big set-piece event, some of which looked like good news to me for the education sector and some of which looked like anything but good news. Katie, in terms of schools and colleges, what did we already know before the spending review about the government's plans?
So before the spending review, I think we already had a fairly good sense of what some of the big headlines were for spending in schools. So a teacher pay rise had already been confirmed. So that was 4% in 2024-25, and estimates put that cost at around 800 million to £1 billion for schools. So that was one known pressure point. We also knew about the expansion of free school meals eligibility. So around 500,000 more pupils to qualify for free school meals in schools. That announcement happened a week or so ago now, I think, and came with additional funding of 410 million a year. I'd say the biggest looming issue, I guess, was special educational needs and disabilities, or SEND. We knew before the spending review that local authority deficits in high needs are spiralling, so many councils are in real financial difficulty, and the SEND system overall is under really enormous strain. And there's been lots of talk of major reform in this area for some time now. But before the spending review, there was no clarity about what that might mean and what it might involve. And then for 16 to 19 education, I'd say very little was clear before the spending review. So there are always hopes for more investment, particularly to deal with rising student numbers at the moment. But I'd say that the mood in the sector was kind of cautious at best. And we knew that there were plans for a post-16 strategy, but again, no clear timeline for that. So overall, I think quite a few unknowns for schools and colleges before the SR.
Thank you, Katie. So some cost pressures certainly on the way already, but the government also trying to signal its willingness to invest perhaps in certain areas. Dani, I think it's fair to say that things looked rather less rosy for the higher education sector in terms of the government signalling its commitments going forward. So talk us through what we knew heading into the spending review.
Well, like with any of these major fiscal events, government tends to like to trail good news stories, usually most days with a week lead up to the actual event. So we did have news already on increased research and development funding. So we knew that there was going to be £86 billion put into R&D funding over the spending review period. So that will reach up to about 22 billion by the end of the period 2029, 2030. This is really positive for the sector, particularly for universities that carry out a lot of research, and good for the country as well. I mean, research tends to have quite good financial returns to the wider economy, between £4 to £8 per £1 spent, and also increased public investment tends to stimulate increased private investment as well. So the sector will be hoping that some of this will help stimulate private and corporate investment into R&D as well. We're still waiting to know the exact ways in which that will be distributed, but broadly good news for the sector. Less good news was the Office for Students, which is the higher education regulator in England, their strategic priority grants, which we found out, we got the letter from Bridget Phillipson, from the Secretary of State for Education in May, and she basically writes to the Office for Students telling them how much money they'll get in that pot and how she would like them to distribute it to different HE providers across the sector. And this is a grant that's given to support strategically important but very expensive subjects, so like high-cost STEM subjects where you need a lot of labs and so on, or specialised equipment, and also for programmes supporting widening participation and access in higher education. And in that letter in May, we found out that there was over £100 million cut to the Strategic Priorities grant, given the kind of tight fiscal environment the government's operating in and Rachel Reeves' desire to make efficiencies across all departments. So the Office of Students has been asked to deprioritise high-cost subjects like media studies, journalism, publishing and information services, and put that towards really high-cost STEM subjects that relate to the government's industrial priorities. And they're also making savings through a reduced student premium, which is the money that universities get to support access and widening participation work. So that was less positive for the sector, particularly given the kind of ongoing financial difficulties that many universities are facing anyway.
Yes, I'm sure we'll come on to those financial difficulties in just a moment. Okay, so not a great picture going into the spending review for the HE sector. So let's turn our attention to the spending review itself. Katie, talk us through what the spending review set out for schools and colleges over the next few years.
So for schools, the headline figure was a 4.7 billion cash increase in the core schools budget by 28-29, to the end of the spending review period. And once you take from that the amount that was announced last week that I mentioned to fund the increase in free school meals eligibility, that leaves about 4.2 billion. And that equates to around a 0.9% real terms per pupil increase per year. And just to put that into context, that's a relatively generous settlement for schools. So in recent years, any real terms growth where it has existed has been much more marginal than that. And then there were some other schools elements in the spending review. They were mostly relatively unsurprising. So previously announced breakfast club extensions for primary school pupils were confirmed. The capital investment for schools was relatively similar to recent years, so 2.4 billion per year for the school rebuilding programme. School condition funding is rising roughly with inflation to around 2.3 billion by 29-30, and 2.6 billion for school place planning. But that's really just in response to demographic shifts that are happening, so nothing particularly kind of significant or surprising there. And then in 16 to 19 education, the SR included 1.2 billion of additional skills funding by 28-29, but really without much detail. So we know that that includes increased support for 16 to 19 provision as the pupil bulge moves through the system. And because of that, it probably implies minimal new money for apprenticeships, further education, other forms of skills spending. So no major package for 16 to 19 education in the SR.
You've already mentioned special educational needs and disabilities. What did we find out, if anything, in the spending review about whether the government is going to be investing in that area too?
Yeah, so this is a tricky one because we know that it is on the cards for big reform in the spending review, and it says as much in the spending review documents. And we know that some of the additional money that the school sector is receiving is kind of earmarked for that reform. But what we don't know yet is what that reform is, what it looks like, what it costs, what it will mean for schools. And the government said, I think for the first time, that there's definitely going to be a white paper for SEND in schools published in the autumn. So they're waiting until then to describe what the reform will look like and how much it will cost. So it's a bit of an unknown, I guess, for the school system, whether the additional money that it's receiving is going to be sufficient to cover whatever is needed for the SEND reform.
Okay, so quite a lot of moving parts here. We've got lots more money going into the system, 4.7 billion, as you were saying, but a lot of new plans and new initiatives getting off the ground at the same time, which then will consume some or possibly a large chunk of that extra funding. Dani, there was almost £5 billion extra for schools in the spending review. So what about universities and our higher education system?
We got very little on higher education in the spending review. It's quite interesting. So there were a few parts where you kind of felt like Rachel Reeves might be leading up to something and then nothing came of it. So she talked about how universities are a national asset and, obviously there was a bit on R&D, but there was nothing on kind of the wider financial settlement for universities, nothing on any increased funding for universities or a review of university finances and so on. And again, she made a dig about lifelong learning at the opposition, and we thought maybe we'll get something on the LLE, and then nothing followed from that. We obviously had the confirmation of the R&D uplift that we already knew, the research and development uplift. But you haven't gotten very much from a fiscal event like this when you're then trawling through the extra documents they publish, hoping for something that's a bit more interesting than what was announced. There was a little bit more detail in the document. So there was a reference for a commitment to associate to Horizon Europe and its successor, which again, research-intensive universities will be very happy about. At least $1 billion for the Advanced Research and Invention Agency, ARIA, and confirmation that the government would be funding the supercomputer at Edinburgh. The only other area that we did get a little bit on in the spending review was a brief mention of the international levy or the potential international levy, which we got in the immigration white paper, the government saying that they were considering basically taking away some of the profits that universities make on charging very high international student fees to reinvest that in, they said, the higher education ... and skills system, which was not welcome news to many universities for whom the profit on international student tuition fees at the moment is often one of their only areas keeping them financially afloat. The other thing I found interesting in the documents published associated with the spending review was that in the documents that had to detail the efficiencies that each department were planning to make, there were sections on how the DfE were going to help, for example, schools and FE providers to find and make efficiencies. But again, as often happens, HE is left to its own devices on that one. I think that the sector would really benefit from a helping hand, whether that's the role of the DfE or the OFS or someone else, in thinking, okay, efficiencies need to be made. Where's the best place to make those? Could there potentially be something like a transformation fund, a bit more funding in the short term to help saving in the long term, and so on? But right now it's just a bit of a free-for-all with each university individually expected to know how to best make cuts to make the budget balance.
Yes, quite a different level of attention, I think, given in the spending review to schools and universities. Okay, so in summary, we've got more investment going into schools, but a lot of it might be used up by some big initiatives that we already know are coming down the line. We've maybe got some more money for 16 to 19-year-olds as well, although a lack of detail at this stage, perhaps. And very little attention given to universities in terms of their long-term financial sustainability, and that came off the back of previously announced budget cuts for universities too. So let's turn now to what we should make of all of this, because there's an awful lot to digest, as always, with something as big as a spending review, but I think there are some things we can try and ascertain. Katie, what do you think schools and colleges should make of all of this to start with? Should they be pleased or concerned about the outcome of the spending review?
So for schools to start with, I think you might expect them to be relatively cheered, given that they received more than the other sectors that we're talking about. What I've seen so far is a sort of fairly cautious or muted reaction, I'd say. On the one hand, I think there's relief that core school funding is rising, and I think it's fair to say that it's a better settlement than some feared it might be, given the wider fiscal situation. On the other hand, I think school leaders are saying that this might not go far enough. We know that a big chunk of the increase will be absorbed by teacher pay, but we also know that other cost pressures continue to mount. So support staff salaries, for example, are increasing with the national living wage. Non-staff costs, so costs of things like energy and insurance, remain inflated. There's sort of increasing complexity in pupils, so, increasing mental health needs and so on. And then it's worth pointing out that pupil premium rates remain stagnant and they've not kept pace with either need or inflation. So taken together, these will absorb at least some of the increase, I think, that the school sector has got through this SR, leaving schools in a position where the additional funding probably maintains current provision rather than enabling improvements or sort of massive innovation. And then, as we mentioned earlier on SEND, I do think the sector is pretty worried about that. So while the broader spending review ambition is clearly to enable reforms of the SEND system using the increased funding, I think it's difficult to say what that really means for schools at the moment until the white paper is published. From what we do know, I think that change is likely to be fairly radical, and that SEND reform is likely to be quite a sort of defining narrative for the school system over this Parliament. So for the moment, that remains the biggest sort of unanswered question, I think, within the sector. The schools definitely want reform in this area, but also they just need the resources to make it possible. And then on 16 to 19, from what I have seen so far, I think the sector is sort of welcoming the recognition that more investment is needed. But there's just real concern that the funding doesn't keep pace with either inflation or the complexity of the provision that I think is now expected. It's worth saying too that the documents that accompany the spending review were also notable, I think, for what they didn't say on skills in relation to wider spending. So there were lots of sort of big ticket commitments on infrastructure and energy and defence, but interestingly, no new investment to train workers in these sectors beyond the amount that was announced in the spring statement for construction. So I think there is concern around how we will train the people for these sectors. And then just sort of thinking about what that means for strikes and industrial action, because that's something that we've all been concerned about for some time now, isn't it? I suspect that this settlement is probably enough to avoid strikes, particularly in the short term. But pay deals happen every year. So I think this sort of partly depends on future pay deals and whether they come with additional central funding or whether they're expected to be absorbed by the system. But the main story here, I think, is that the underlying pressures that we all know exist within the system still remain. And there's a sense that while this SR sort of stabilises things, it doesn't set schools or colleges up for long-term sustainability or innovation.
I mean, that certainly matches a lot of the commentary that I've been reading from head teachers in terms of they think it could have been worse. So on the one hand, this sort of glass half full, this definitely could have been a worse settlement. But at the same time, they're looking ahead to increased cost pressures from various sources, as you were saying. So is it fair to say this leaves things quite finely poised in terms of how the next few years are going to develop?
I think so. And we'll have to see what happens in some of these areas. So we'll have to see what the school's white paper says. We'll have to see what the post-16 strategy says. We don't know enough, I don't think, about these things to be able to know whether the funding announced this week is sufficient to cover the ambition.
So perhaps a period of stability, but we're not quite sure how long it's going to last for if the cost pressures keep ramping up. Dani, discussions of university funding were, as you were saying, notable by their absence in the spending review. So first things first, were you surprised by this absence?
I wasn't personally surprised by this absence. I mean, this is the third fiscal event of this government in which we have not had anything substantial on higher education, and particularly not on the funding of higher education. At this point, I'm not surprised. I think it's quite a contrast to how the sector was feeling initially getting a Labour government. There was a lot of optimism initially, particularly with Manifesto talking about reviewing, the tertiary education, bringing tertiary closer together, the opportunity mission. Sounded like there might be some big changes there, talking about how the funding system was unsustainable. I think that there was certainly an expectation that Labour was going to do more and faster than it has done on HE finance. I wasn't surprised. It is still disappointing that it has been 3 major fiscal events, and whilst we've had some good news, like the increase in R&D funding will be really positive, particularly for research-intensive universities, there's this larger issue of many in the sector feel the funding settlement is unsustainable. The government itself has spoken about it being unsustainable, and yet we don't feel any closer to, okay, then what is next? Is it just that we are now asking students to accept that fees will rise indefinitely forever, and that they will probably get less and less as well in return for those fees, or at least feel that they're getting less, whether that's kind of true or not? There is certainly kind of an increasing feeling from students about what value they're getting in return. And universities will continue to have to cut costs where they can. Redundancy programs and restructuring will continue. The strategy that the government has taken so far, it feels like, is a roll of the dice and hope that it's not the type of universities that they really like that fall over. People are talking about managed decline, but to me it feels less managed than that even. I'm not someone who thinks that universities need necessarily a kind of a huge uplift, and that they cannot possibly sustain themselves on a lower level of funding than they've had before. But the way in which government's approached it, with what seems from the outside is pretty much no planning, no help for the sector in where they want them to make efficiencies, no transformation fund like we're seeing kind of civil service get and so on, just seems to be very risky from my perspective.
Well, as Katie's already mentioned, we have got this post-16 education strategy paper later this year. So on the point around planning, Dani, how much comfort will the prospect of this paper bring to the higher education sector in terms of its financial position? Should they take heart from the government giving itself a bit more time to think about these issues rather than trying to deal with it in a spending review? Or should they be very worried about the lack of a clear plan for at least another few months?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be too negative, and I always hope that I'm kind of proven wrong later down the line, but the post-16 strategy as it stands, from what I'm hearing, doesn't fill me with any hope, really. I mean, I think particularly that it is now coming after the spending review, which means departmental budgets are set. There's even less flexibility than there was before for major reform or new funding through the post-16 strategy. We've also gone from a situation in which we were expecting quite a large review of tertiary as a whole, and with an expectation that that would include a substantial review of how higher education is funded, not just the amount, but how that's distributed. Is it distributed in the right way? Is this how we want to fund the system? Is this sustainable in the long term? It's gone from something that felt like it could be quite transformational from a kind of policy and regulatory perspective, even if not from necessarily loads new money in the system, but maybe different ways of looking at the system, to what we're hearing now, which is that that at least the HE section is going to be a very small chapter in a larger strategy on post-16, that there's not much on that joining up of different parts of the system. We've had very little about this kind of joint up whole system, tertiary system that we had early on. And I'd also note that the post-16 strategy, I mean, as far as I know, it has been written, or at least a draft of it has been written since at least December last year, and has just been going through kind of endless iterations. And I worry what value it can bring after a spending review. Potentially it could have been more impactful before the spending review, but when you combine the fact that the spending review's done, department budgets are set, very little wiggle room for Rachel Reeves and for the DfE going forwards, and the fact that we're hearing that the HE bit is just being made smaller in this larger strategy, I don't take much comfort from that. I don't know whether, obviously, the Education Committee did a kind of rapid fire evidence gathering session on HE finances, where they invited people to submit evidence, and this was part of their concern, is the current system sustainable? And they've now announced another call for evidence, another consultation particularly looking at international student fees, looking at the risk of a university closure and bankruptcy and how that could be prevented. Maybe that might put a bit more political pressure on to do something a bit more substantial on HE funding, but we'll have to wait and see.
We will indeed. Katie, what are your thoughts on this post-16 education strategy? As Dani's mentioned, the spending review has already happened. The funding envelope is fixed, but the government still, in theory at least, could be planning some wider changes. So how do you see this playing out? What would be a good outcome in this respect?
So what happens is the overall quantum is set in a spending review, and bits and pieces are allocated out officially through the announcements and through the documents. But there is now a process within government departments for ministers and officials to decide, kind of knowing now what they have to work with, where will they prioritise funding. So they'll be doing a look across all of the things they were bidding for funding on, and now going through a sort of prioritisation process. So it's not that there are no decisions left and that there is no way to influence what is happening kind of over the next 3 years, but we know the kind of scope within which it's possible to influence. And now there's a process to kind of agree the detail of that within government departments. So I don't know what that will mean in terms of, how that relates to the post-16 strategy document. But I suspect it's not quite as bleak as you might otherwise have thought. And there will definitely be processes going on within the department to think about how it navigates that document and publishing that document and the commitments within it based on the overall quantum that it now knows it has to work within.
Okay, we are almost at the end of this episode, so it's time for one last question. As you were just saying, Katie, now that the spending review has been finalised, we know what the overall funding envelope is for the DfE over the next few years. So the education sector should probably not be expecting too much additional investment beyond what has been announced, although it's not completely out of the question, I suppose. But on the basis that we've got the broad framework now set, the coming years really are going to come down to a question of prioritisation. Within a fixed funding envelope, how and where should the DfE invest its funds to improve outcomes for children, young people and adults? Because ultimately, investing more in one area could potentially mean taking money away from another area. So my question is, which part of the DfE's plans do you think are currently most in need of more funding within this fixed funding envelope? Katie, when you look at the pre-18 schools and colleges landscape, what do you think needs to be prioritised within the DfE's spending plans as we roll forward?
So for me, there are three areas that need prioritisation. So the one that we were just talking about, the 16 to 19 sector, we know that sixth forms and FE colleges are educating more students with increasingly complex needs, but their funding has lagged behind and the core rate is effectively falling in real terms. And also staffing shortages here remains a major issue. So I do think if we want an effective post-16 system and one that supports the government's other ambitions, so on social mobility and the country's skills needs, then I do think that needs to be supported with funding. The second area is another one that we've mentioned already, so that's special educational needs and disabilities. So as we've said, schools and councils are under really intense strain. And while we know that reform has been promised, there is real anxiety about what that will look like, but also how it might impact pupils and parents, as well as teachers, and then crucially for this conversation, how it will be funded. The high needs system is already facing huge deficits, and schools are absorbing more need than they're funded for. If this is going to be a defining issue, then the funding has to match the ambition. And then the third one for me is teacher pay. We've seen good increases in teacher pay over the last couple of years, but I don't think we can stop here. And I think there's an expectation that pay increases will continue and need to continue because we know that there remains a very serious teacher recruitment and retention problem all the way through schools into colleges and post-16. So that feels like an area that we can't just deprioritise, and that will need consistent funding, I think, over the next 3 years.
Thank you, Katie. Dani, we haven't yet seen much good news for the HE sector, but if and when the DfE sets out its plans for higher education, what do you think needs to be prioritised within that?
Well, I've just got one main priority, and I actually think it's maybe the most likely priority for the DfE for Bridget Phillipson too, and that's student maintenance. We know that in this country, university is the best route for social mobility for a disadvantaged young person. But it's becoming increasingly hard for students to be able to make the most out of their time at university. It has always been the case that going to university isn't just about sitting in a lecture hall and getting your assignments done, although that's the core provision, that's really important. But everything that comes with that, this is why we have that traditional 3-year residential model and value that model, because there is a expectation that the other things in university life also add value. So the networks that you make when you're there, maybe being part of the debating club or running to be the Students' Union president or taking on voluntary and unpaid opportunities that help develop employability skills and, again, help build those networks are so important, and sometimes I think just as important to the skills and experiences that a young person gets from that university experience. But what we're seeing is that increasingly maintenance isn't sufficient to allow students to engage in that wider activity. And in some cases, for particularly vulnerable groups of students, so I'm thinking about care leavers, estranged students, disabled students, students who have caring responsibilities, it's not even sufficient for them to be able to engage in the academic side, let alone the extracurricular side as well. So we've got, at the moment, a quarter of students who are working above the point at which we would deem it to be detrimental to their academic work, which is above 15 hours per week. Below that, it's generally good for employability, good for students to be working a little bit part-time alongside their studies, but above 15 hours, there's quite strong academic evidence that it starts to decrease grades and graduate outcomes and so on. And this is primarily because the student maintenance amount that young people can receive, it hasn't risen with inflation, so it increasingly doesn't often even cover housing costs for students, let alone anything else like books and activities and travel and so on. But also the other area that I think is really important that's maybe spoken about a little bit less is that the household income threshold, so the point at which a student can start receiving student maintenance and then at which it increases as your household income decreases, that also hasn't been uprated with wage inflation either. So students are getting less in real terms than they did, and less students are eligible for support as well than previously. And what I find frustrating is that this sits, uprating student maintenance, we had a small increase before, but uprating student maintenance in line with inflation, committing to that rising with inflation perhaps every year, and re-evaluating the household income bands fits so perfectly with Labour's opportunity mission. But from what I hear, they just haven't been able to get it past the Treasury. And I think that that's a real disappointment, because from my point of view, it's not just a moral imperative that any person from any background should be able to go to university and benefit from it. If they've gotten into that university and they are working hard, they should also be able to engage in all the other parts of a university experience. But it's also, I think, there's quite a strong economic case. If the state is subsidising a student to go to university, loaning them the money for tuition fees, but then not giving them the maintenance support that they need to be able to actually engage in their studies, there comes a point where you think actually government's probably losing some money, some of that return that they would want from higher education, because students are having to work so much in order to just afford housing costs and so on. So I think you can make very good moral arguments, but also quite good economic return arguments for why it's good to invest in young people being able to fully engage with their education.
Thank you, Dani. And that brings us to the end of this episode. My thanks to Dani and Katie for helping us interpret the outcome of the spending review for the education sector. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do share it with others and leave a good rating wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you join me when I next go inside your ed. Bye-bye for now.